Alrighty, good morning folks, and welcome back to the Sunshine State Rails. It is Thursday, October 19th, and I've made my way to the Palmetto subdivision. Morning before work, because through the grapevine I heard a thing or two about a rebuilt locomotive that will be on today's L700, the Juice Train. So regular viewers, y'all may remember that a few videos of mine ago, I talked about CSX's SD70 rebuild program in Huntington, West Virginia, where they take older SD70MAC or M models and give them new electronics and whatnot else to give them a new lease on life and keep them running for the railroad. For the longest time, that only applied for the Flared Radiator SD70MACs. You'll notice in the rear, they had flared and flat models. And for the first few years, it only applied for the flat radiator models. But this year, they've started the flared models too. They've started rebuilding most of those. There's quite a few of them out running now. But personally, that locomotive model, the flared SD70MAC or M, whatever railroad has whatever designation for it, that engine build is my personal favorite. Why? Couldn't tell you. Looks cool, sounds cool, that's it. But number 4714 was in the lead of last night's IO45 intermodal from Jacksonville Ramp to Tampa, and that train usually takes their engines and puts them on the following morning's L700 to Bradenton and back. And so for that reason, the 4714, which has been out of Huntington for about a month, should be leading L700 this morning. So we've set up at Old Reliable, Little Manatee River, and we're just gonna stake it out until I hear something. The sun's come up pretty well, but I'm hoping that by the time I get around to actually make a video out of these clips from this morning, that I'll have been able to, by that point, have seen another instance or more of these new Flared Radiator rebuild Macs. So I can have a little more material to put into a video and actually be able to look over them a little closer, have more time to actually get up close and personal with them because they look really nice. At least, I think they look nice. I haven't actually seen any of these new rebuild Flared Macs in person yet, so this will be my first one this morning once it makes it to me. So we'll stake it out and see what we get. To ultimately save y'all my wait, I ended up missing the train before I even got there, so the train had, unbeknownst to me, passed southbound already. Though while we're here, we will take a quick note of the Little Manatee River and how much this swing bridge has changed since I've started watching trains here many years ago. Located about halfway down the Palmetto subdivision, which is still dark territory on CSX to this day, the bridge has been totally rewired and has all new long-range antennas in conjunction with new remote control capabilities. This location used to require an on-site bridge tender to show up and manually open and close the bridge. Now, just like the other 4 movable rail bridges in the Tampa Bay area, this one can be remotely controlled from the Alafia River Bridge Tender Control Center. Up until 2020, the bridge used to adorn the lettering of the former Atlantic Coast Line Railroad, the operators of this line, after its builders, Tampa Southern. The signals that were interlocked to this bridge to govern train movements over it were also some of the most unique signals I had ever seen anywhere. And they outlived many of the other replacements that CSX had ultimately made in these areas, but eventually with the rewiring and retooling, they too came down. Now, brand new Safe Train aluminum masts guard this bridge. I suppose the silver lining to this, though, is that CSX ultimately did donate the signals to us at the Florida Railroad Museum, and we have them in the back of our property. Saved from the scrapper's torch they were, but the Little Manatee River doesn't look or feel the same as it used to. After its mechanical upgrades, signal replacements, and installation of relay cases to house all the new electronics, just doesn't feel the same as it ever did before. But, as they say, the only thing that you can truly count on in life is change. Later on in the day, I was able to slip out from work during my lunch break and head back over to the Palmetto subdivision to catch L700 on their return trip from Bradenton. I paralleled the train by Apollo Beach, and though the SD70 locomotive is now in the trailing position, it still was my first ever sighting of one of these new rebuilds, so I leapfrogged the train a few miles further to Gibsonton to set up.
L700 is returning to Tampa now with loaded Tropicana reefers as well as miscellaneous freight that's just returned from Bradenton or Sarasota. All of this miscellaneous stuff will eventually make it onto a manifest freight train out of Tampa, but once L700 cleared me here at Gibsonton, I had places to return to. The motive power for this L700, though, would eventually make it onto an I-044 intermodal train bound for Jacksonville. And this would be the last I would see of these new SD70 rebuilds until I headed that way myself later that month. A very thick fog and a full moon found me heading northward out of state at ungodly morning hours October 30th. I was up this morning as I was heading for one of America's most iconic rail fanning locations, Folkston, Georgia. A buddy of mine and I had planned this weekend getaway just to get away for a while and watch some trains. Though on this trip, Folkston would be our home base, though we would not be limited to just Folkston. And as a result, we would see a handful more of the SD70MAC rebuilds on this trip. And that's what we're going to focus on here. Quickly, I'll show you this example that happened to roll up on me in Folkston while we were sitting around. Coming northbound from Baldwin was unit train G388. Grain empties from the Florida Gulf and Atlantic Railroad on the Florida Panhandle back to Evansville, Indiana. By sheer happenstance, this train happened to have another instance of the SD70 rebuild, number 4736, trailing second. It was rather unique to see an SD70 on this train in particular because I don't believe these grain trains run too often. The Florida Gulf and Atlantic, I believe, receives one of these trains about once a month. Now we've seen two of these new SD70s in trailing positions. So now you're saying, alright Dakota, when's the part we get to see one lead? And don't worry, I'm getting there. That would finally happen later this day. Via the live trackside camera in Waycross, Georgia, we were able to observe train M492 departing Rice Yard, headed towards Hamlet, North Carolina. That train doesn't run anywhere close to Folkston, but once we saw what it had on it, we knew that we would go out of our way if we had to. And thanks to a fairly recent CSX project, we wouldn't have to cover too much distance to close the gap. About an hour to sundown and we find ourselves at the railroad interlocking in Nahunta, Georgia. This is where the Brunswick subdivision running southeast out of Waycross crosses over the north-south Nahunta subdivision between Jessup and Folkston. While a fairly middle-of-nowhere small town, Nahunta was recently the site of a very interesting CSX project. To depict that project, we're going to take a look at the route that runs from Jessup, Georgia to Waycross, Georgia. That line, as a straight shot, is the Jessup subdivision. That is the primary route for CSX trains from Waycross headed up or down the eastern coast of the United States. However, just outside of Waycross, the Brunswick subdivision branches off and runs southeast to Brunswick, Georgia. That line only saw one local train to Brunswick each day. That was until CSX decided to utilize the Brunswick subdivision to ease the strain on the Jessup subdivision between Waycross and Jessup. Using 1,500 feet of new track, CSX built a brand new turnout to connect the west side of the Brunswick subdivision to the north side of the Nahunta subdivision at the Nahunta interlocking. With the new turnout installed, and although there are still sometimes exceptions to this, any trains coming out of Waycross will now take the Brunswick subdivision to Nahunta to turn north onto the Nahunta subdivision before reconverging with the Jessup subdivision at Jessup. While trains headed to Waycross will take the Jessup subdivision straight all the way into Waycross. That effectively keeps opposing trains away from each other and prevents dispatchers from having to make meets between Jessup and Waycross for opposing trains. And as this M492 is a northbound train, we knew that there was a good chance it would take the Brunswick subdivision down to Nahunta where we could intercept. And we were there about 15 minutes, and we found that we were exactly right. M492, manifest freight from Waycross, Georgia to Hamlet, North Carolina, would be turning the Nahunta connection with a brand new instance of the Flared SD70MAC rebuild. You would be a fool to assume that we were not about to chase this thing northward. So we got back on US 301 and hit the road. We knew that once 492 got out of that turnout that they were going to pick up a lot of speed. It's straight track from Nahunta all the way to Jessup. But parallel US 301 is pretty straight too. We decided to set up next at the Trudy Road crossing just across the Satilla River in Hortense, Georgia. Now that we're through Nahunta, we really are back into the middle-of-nowhere acres of southern Georgia. And what is effectively a pine tree tunnel here across the Satilla River really went to amplify all the sensations of the train at track speed. M492 was ultimately an intriguing train all around. The SD70 leader, which had been out of the Huntington shops for no more than a few weeks at this point, a Yellow Nose 2 AC4400 in the middle of the train, which I didn't happen to get on film, and an SD40-2 coming from Waycross number 8225, and the LED strobe lights mounted to the cab lead me to believe that it was a remote switcher for some location, possibly heading out for servicing or heading back from servicing in Waycross. Interesting though that they left the locomotive online and pulling the train. Those kinds of smaller locomotives are usually left dead in tow for shuttle transport moves like that. The ultimate distance between Nahunta and Jessup is about 30 miles, though we were only granted one shot between the two because, like I said earlier, it's straight track all the way there, and they don't slow down for much of anything unless another train shows up. The Nahunta subdivision isn't exactly known to be poppin' at the end of the day. So these guys would be the only train out here until they made it to Jessup. We made it to Jessup only about 5 minutes before they did. Jessup is a nice little southern city in Wayne County. They have an Amtrak station here for the Silver Star and Meteor services, as well as a couple of railfan-themed platforms and a whole bunch of gazebos and historic sites in the downtown region. Here in Jessup is where the Jessup subdivision from Waycross and the Nahunta subdivision from Folkston converge back together in a double-track main. We'd arrived to a high green signal on the southbound Jessup sub and a distant K5LA coming north from the Nahunta sub. But we couldn't ponder the situation for very long. Like I said, 5 minutes and he was here.
492, wild out all the way, just as he did. On final track 2, got cleared. Downtown, got 47, 13.
Every now and again in this sport, things will just end up going your way. The high green signal on track 1 was for mixed manifest shuttle train L727, and he just so happened to reach Jessup at the same time that M492 was coming north, making for a rolling meet through downtown. .727 is a daily running long-distance local shuttle between Savannah, Georgia and Waycross, Georgia and back, shuttling manifest freight between the East Savannah and Waycross yards. The clear signal indication keeps 727 on the Jessup subdivision, which they will take for a straight shot into Waycross. Our pursuit of 492 would conclude here with the end of train device clearing town. All in all, leaving me with, as a spectator, a very memorable first impression of these new EMD rebuilds. But for now, this is the last that we'd see of the SD70s for a couple of days. .6 a.m., November 1st, and I'm back on US 301 headed northward for Jessup, Georgia. Now, wait a minute, weren't we just there? Yeah, we were. Now we're going back again. I made it back up there just after sunrise and ran over to the local Dunkin' Donuts for some breakfast. I'm back in Jessup this morning as we got word of an M693 headed south for Waycross with another one of the new SD70 rebuilds on the point. Though this one would have a fairly interesting twist to it. We'll get to that in a moment. Arriving back at the Amtrak station, Amtrak Silver Meteor number 97 would shortly pull into the station to pick up and drop off a few passengers headed for Florida. The worn hard and put away wet P42 locomotives on the point of today's train have been a true testament to Amtrak's corporate name in their 21st century operations. Though it's likely with the new Siemens Charger locomotives coming on the scene that these locomotives won't be seen on Amtrak silver trains for that much longer. The Meteor's next stop on the line would be Jacksonville, Florida, and my next stop was Jessup, Georgia, so I stayed put. The train we're here for, M693, is a daily manifest freight train running from Russell, Kentucky to Waycross, Georgia. The thing about this train, however, is that Russell, Kentucky is the closest originating train yard to Huntington, West Virginia, which is the location that all of these SD70s are being rebuilt. So, quite often, some of Huntington's newest rebuilds out of the shop can make it onto this train. And this morning would be no exception. The morning's wait would finally draw to a close around 9:45 a.m. as a peculiar pair of headlights would appear over the hill. 693, our train, is on the right. Dispatch is running them on track 2 as a local out of Waycross would be working industries set off the track 1. So, here in downtown Jessup, the dispatcher is giving them a medium clear indication. And as advertised, the southbound M693 would have one of Huntington's newest rebuilds in the lead.
M693 got medium clear. Just 47.
The medium clear indication takes 693 off of track 2 and back over to track 1, maintaining the Jessup subdivision for their straight southward shot into Waycross. Now, here's the twist. Our leader number 4757 does not look new by any means at all. it's actually still wearing its original coat of CSX paint from the early 2000s. But it is no lie when I say that this was, at the time, one of the newest rebuilds out of the Huntington shop. All of the mechanical and electronic changes have since been made and are operational, however the locomotive just hasn't received its new coat of paint yet. Now, this seems to be a reoccurring theme for these SD70 rebuilds out of Huntington, though why I still haven't gotten an answer for. Sometimes the SD70s will receive their new coat of paint in the Huntington shops before release, and sometimes they will be sent to Waycross for their repaint. So what we're seeing here is effectively the shuttle of locomotive number 4757 from Huntington to Waycross for its repaint. Though because everything on the locomotive is in working order, the locomotive can lead the train, and is doing so in this case. The following chase of M693 to Waycross would not be an easy one. This is all new territory for me, and track speed for these trains on the Jessup sub is about 60 miles an hour. Now, the mostly parallel Georgia 38 allows for high speeds as well, though only between small towns. Once you reach those small towns, it gets pretty difficult. But a good 23 miles later, and I managed to get in front and get myself set up just outside the small town of Patterson, Georgia.
Yeah, 693 got cleared. Signal Patterson. 4757 something.
CSX Equipment Defect Detector milepost 573.9er. No defects. No defects. Total axle 686. End of transmission.
Pacing the train down the final 18 miles of track to Waycross, we'd be able to get in front once again as they'd slow down outside the city limits, allowing for myself and a handful of other friends to set up at the tracks off of Screven Avenue, just outside of Rice Yard, across the tracks from the former Atlantic Coastline Depot, that which now hosts a rail fanning platform, as well as one of Virtual Railfan's live trackside camera feeds. 693, dodging a handful of other movements around Waycross, would finally get their permission to enter Rice Yard after their multi-day journey south from Russell, Kentucky.
693. And I'm across the old to the mechanical lead back to the tower to R07, road number 7. Alright, road 7, here we go. What I like to hear. Well, that'll be myself.
An aerial view of 693 entering Rice Yard truly gives you an idea of the scale of the operations around Waycross. Waycross, for good reason, is one of the most well-known freight yards on the CSX system. This giant property that is Rice Yard is actually a culmination of many flat switching yards as well as a giant hump yard. This combination of yards ultimately handles traffic from everywhere between Chicago and the eastern United States. Dozens upon dozens of trains ultimately depart and arrive at Waycross every day. Waycross is also the site of one of CSX's many deadlines or lines of retired or sidelined locomotives, as well as a giant mechanical facility that repairs locomotives and repaints them as well. Each one of CSX's new heritage locomotives that have began running their system in the latter part of 2023 have been repainted here in Waycross. And within the next few weeks, this 4757 on this morning's M693 will visit that booth for its repaint as well. This eastern side of Waycross is ultimately the busiest. The Jessup subdivision from Folkston coming in from the south, the Jessup subdivision from Jessup coming in from the east, and the Fitzgerald subdivision from Birmingham and Atlanta coming in from the north. The traffic volume is evident here as another train is arriving into Rice Yard at the same time as 693. Each train is entering a different section of Rice Yard to be sorted in different places. These trains will ultimately be broken up here into many little blocks and sent off to other parts of the United States. Ultimately though, our chase of 693 this morning went pretty well. We managed a few more shots of the new locomotives, as well as the ability to document a fairly unique practice of CSX sending said locomotive to Waycross for repaint rather than Huntington. This would be the last I'd see of the SD70s on this trip though, until the very last day. Amidst everything else going on, something else was a-brewing up north that would make for a unique occurrence on our very last day. That brings us down to Callahan, Florida just before 5 p.m. November 2nd. I was set up atop the US 301 overpass for southbound intermodal I-037 from Charlotte, North Carolina to Jacksonville. And I've got minimal time to explain here, but Callahan is the junction of the Nahunta subdivision and the Callahan subdivision breaking off to the southwest, running down towards Baldwin. I-037 would stay straight on the Nahunta through Callahan, with another one of the SD70 rebuilds in the lead. The unique occurrence here is that the two locomotives on the head of I-037 this evening were the same two locomotives that were set for power on the M492 that we chased at the beginning of this video. Numbers 4713 and 539 made their way from Hamlet, North Carolina to Charlotte, North Carolina, where they were tacked on to this I-037 back to Jacksonville. Just funny how those things tend to work out sometimes. A very short I-037 today. 37 is intermodal for Jacksonville and the Florida East Coast Railway interchange. This is why, as I followed the train into Jacksonville, we'd have to watch them pull in at CSX's Moncrief Freight Yard rather than the Jacksonville intermodal ramp because the train is not being unloaded here. It's simply being brought through Jacksonville, eventually down to FEC's Bowden Yard where the train will continue onto their system towards Miami. Area rail fans who are familiar with this train in particular may also notice it looks a bit different as there are no Crowley containers to be found on here. Now, said area rail fans who are familiar with this train will likely then know why that is, but if you don't, stay tuned for a future video I have planned about intermodals around Jacksonville in which I will explain exactly why. I'll save the rest of this train for that video as well. We're focused on the SD70MACs, and I have one more instance that I caught before I decided to put this video together. December 19th of 2023 found me at CSX's Vitus Junction in Richland, Florida, just south of Dade City. This is the diverging point for the Vitus subdivision headed towards Lakeland, and the Wildwood subdivision headed towards Zephyr Hills, and from there, the Yeoman subdivision headed to Tampa. While not what I was expecting, I pulled into Vitus this afternoon to find a medium clear signal set for a train coming off of the Yeoman side of Vitus from Tampa. A 10-minute wait at Vitus would reveal pretty quickly what the train was. Returning from southern Tampa Bay was empty unit train B240, a fairly new service to Rockport Yard off of Tampa Bay's eastern side. This train would have come into town a few days prior loaded with potash from Canada's giant reserves near Saskatchewan. The potash is sent by rail to CSX's Rockport Yard in Tampa, where it is transloaded to ships for overseas transportation to a customer in the Caribbean. As you'll notice, the dispatcher is sending B240 over from track 1 to 2 here at Vitus. This is pretty much the beginning of an almost 5-mile-long double-track main that begins here at Vitus and runs north to the control point Ellerslie, where it singles back up just south of Dade City. While this wasn't the train I was here for, I knew that the one I was here for should be getting close at about this time, and it made me suspect that since they were sending him over to track 2, they could be meeting that train at Ellerslie. So I followed B240 north, stopping at the sweeping curve just north of the Richland crossovers. I had always wanted to see a southbound train come through this curve, and the sun was perfect for a southbound train, so I stuck it out here. And after not too long a wait, my suspicions were confirmed by radio. CSX train M441 was calling signals through Dade City. M441 is manifest freight running daily from CSX's giant rice yard in Waycross, southbound for Tampa, Florida. Because at the time I shot this, said train worked both Baldwin and Wildwood yards on their way south to Tampa, the times they would make it down to this area of Florida were pretty unpredictable at this time, and on this day it just so happened to work out that they'd make it here in some perfect afternoon winter light. And what's more, today's iteration of M441 would just so happen to have one of CSX's Flared SD70 rebuilds in the lead, number 4741. While making for a very unique and pretty shot, my location wasn't exactly ideal for getting out and pacing a train. So I met my share of struggles trying to stay with this guy on the roads headed south. But a bit of a traffic jam on the line ahead called for the train to come to a stop between the switches at Knight's Siding. Amtrak's Silver Star still had to get across the diamond at Plant City, and an on-track inspector at Valrico had to get off the track before M441 could proceed. But it was perfect for me as it allowed me to catch back up to the head end, as well as get some detail shots of the beautiful EMD locomotive sitting still. Here we'll take a look at some of the visible upgrades that these SD70s have gotten from their formerly retired counterparts. Now, I don't know for certain all of the upgrades or changes that have been made to these locomotives in the Huntington shop, but there are at least a few that we can openly observe while it's sitting right here. Some of these include, but are not limited to, new axles and bearings, traction motor replacement, likely new radiator cooling fans, upgraded electronics, computer systems and climate control, the acquired ability to run remotely as distributed power, and, as never seen before on these SD70 models, a new coat of CSX paint, their new website livery scheme, referred to by most railfans as YN3C or Yellownose 3C. To me, this new paint scheme has been a hit ever since they've started applying it to the locomotives, and I think to no exception that it looks fabulous on these SD70s. The overhauled SD70s also retain a very unique symbol, a rebuild sticker provided by Huntington, custom made for each locomotive that comes out of the shop. It includes the project ID, the rebuild year, as well as a locomotive rendition that includes each locomotive's custom number. Something interesting that I've noticed though is that if the SD70 is sent to Waycross for repaint like our 4757, that it won't receive one of these rebuild stickers. So only those that are repainted in Huntington will receive these decals. That said, that makes for kind of an interesting way to tell where an SD70 was repainted. Huntingtons have these rebuild stickers, the Waycross ones do not. Enough time to exchange information, but not so much for a chat. 441 was only stopped here about 5 minutes before they started rolling again, as they had somewhere to be, Yeoman Yard in Tampa, with a long train of manifest waiting for delivery. Everybody was in the clear, and 441's signals had come back up, so before they gained too much speed, I got a head start and rolled down the hill to Plant City. And I won't say too much about this yet, but just take a moment and appreciate the horn on this locomotive as it rolls through the strawberry capital.
CSX 44118, locomotive 4741, clear Sandler Junction, Plant City, interlocking. Stella.
M441 would be the last train that I'd catch with one of these SD70 rebuilds before I decided to finally put my instances together into this video. Though, what I neglected to say before is that this would also be one of the last trains that I'd catch in Plant City before the no horn zone would go into effect on the S-Line. It had been known since early 2021 that CSX planned on making the S-Line route through Plant City a quiet zone, so that trains would no longer sound their horns through the downtown region on that route. What's odd about that, though, is that this no horn zone exempts the perpendicular A-Line route from this, so trains will still blow their horns on that line through town. Though regardless of the odd antics, this M441, with the exception of a few more trains that I'd catch after it in town that night, would be one of the last trains that I'd catch on this S-Line route still blowing their horns. I've only been to Plant City one time since this day, and it was after the new year. The no horn zone went into effect only about 2 weeks after I shot this video. So then I suppose we've come full circle, because as I said at the very beginning of this video, the only thing that you can really count on in life is change. Thank y'all for coming along with me on this set of adventures today, where we observed and reviewed some of CSX's new SD70 overhauls. I'm looking forward to catching a lot more of these in the coming years, and I hope that y'all can as well. Happy belated 2024, I hope y'all enjoyed this one, and I hope that y'all stick around for the next one. So, in a soon-to-be-changed Plant City, Florida, this is Kotabeaner, and I will see you next time, wherever that may be, on the Sunshine State Rails.